This courtroom is compromised, and that man should not be sitting on that bench. The words didn't just interrupt the trial. They sliced through it, sharp and deliberate, echoing off polished wood and quiet authority like something that had been waiting too long to be said out loud. Every head turned at once. Pins froze mid-sentence. A juror's hand hovered above a notepad, unmoving. The air shifted, heavy now, charged with something more than tension, something personal. Officer Kyle Donovan stood just inside the courtroom doors, shoulders squared, badge catching the overhead light, his presence loud without needing volume. He hadn't been called. He hadn't been invited. But there he was, stepping forward like he owned the room. At the bench, Judge Nathaniel Brooks didn't react right away. He didn't slam the gavel. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at the man who had just broken protocol in front of 12 jurors, 2 attorneys, and a courtroom that had, until that moment, been operating under order. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes sharpened. Calculated. Controlled. Watching. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we're glad you're here. Now, back to Judge Nathaniel Brooks. He sat still, hands resting lightly on the bench as if anchored there, as if nothing in this room could move him unless he allowed it. That silence stretched longer than it should have. Long enough for discomfort to bloom. Long enough for people to start wondering whether the interruption had weight. Officer Donovan took another step forward, boots firm against the courtroom floor. I have reason to believe this entire proceeding is compromised, he said, louder now, letting the words land where they would. A murmur rippled through the gallery. One of the attorneys shifted uncomfortably. The bailiff glanced toward the judge, waiting for instruction that hadn't yet come. Still, Nathaniel Brooks didn't flinch. He had seen this before. Not this exact moment, not this exact man, but this energy, this assumption, this boldness that came dressed as authority but smelled like something else entirely. Years ago, long before the robe, long before the bench, there had been rooms where his voice was questioned before he even spoke. Rooms where his presence required explanation. Rooms where people, like Donovan, believed interruption was entitlement. But that was then. This was now. And this was his courtroom. Officer, Nathaniel finally said, his voice low, even, cutting through the noise without force. You are out of line. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The room heard it anyway. Donovan didn't back down. If anything, he leaned into it, jaw set, eyes fixed. With respect, Your Honor, he replied, though nothing in his tone carried respect. You shouldn't be presiding over this case. The words hung there, heavier now. Not just a challenge, but a statement. A line drawn. Somewhere in the second row, a woman shifted in her seat, her expression tightening. A clerk near the side desk glanced down at the case file, then back up again, uncertainty flickering across her face. Something wasn't right. Not just the interruption, but the certainty behind it. The way Donovan spoke like he already knew something no one else did. Or thought he did. Nathaniel Brooks leaned back slightly in his chair, just enough to create space, just enough to observe. He didn't rush. He didn't react. He let the moment breathe. Because moments like this revealed more than words ever could. On what grounds? He asked calmly. Donovan exhaled once, steadying himself like he was preparing to take control of something that didn't belong to him. New evidence, he said. Evidence that changes everything. The courtroom stilled again. Completely this time. No whispers. No shifting. Just attention. Focused. Waiting. But Judge Brooks didn't move toward urgency. He didn't lean forward. He didn't demand immediate explanation. Instead, he watched Donovan the way a seasoned man watches a storm roll in, measuring not just its noise, but its direction. Because in that moment, it wasn't the claim that mattered. It was the timing, the entrance, the tone, and something about all of it didn't align. Not with procedure, not with truth, and definitely not with the law. The silence did not break all at once. It stretched, thin and deliberate, like something waiting to snap. And in that silence, every eye in the courtroom shifted between the man who had just challenged authority and the man who held it without ever raising his voice. Judge Nathaniel Brooks remained still, but there was nothing passive about it. His presence filled the bench in a way that did not need volume to command attention. It was The kind of control that came from knowing exactly when not to move. Officer Kyle Donovan mistook that stillness for hesitation, and that was his first mistake. He stepped further into the well of the courtroom, crossing an invisible line that most would never dare approach without permission, his confidence growing with each second that no one stopped him. The evidence was submitted late last night. He continued, his tone steady but edged with something sharper, something that sounded less like procedure and more like intention. It directly impacts the integrity of this case. The prosecution attorney shifted in his seat, flipping through a thick stack of documents that suddenly felt incomplete, his brow tightening as he scanned for something that was not there. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "the state has not received any such submission." A ripple moved through the jury box, subtle but unmistakable. 12 people who had been following facts now forced to question whether those facts had just changed without their knowledge. Judge Brooks turned his head slightly, not toward Donovan, but toward the clerk seated to his right. "Check the record," he said, calm and precise. The clerk, a young woman named Allison Grant, straightened in her chair and quickly began typing, her fingers moving fast across the keyboard as she searched the system logs. The soft clicking of keys became the only sound in the room. Seconds passed, then more. Her expression shifted, just slightly, but enough to be noticed by those paying close attention. "Your Honor," she said, her voice careful. There was a submission time-stamped at 2:14 a.m. That changed the air again. Not dramatically, not loudly, but enough to tilt the balance. Donovan nodded once, as if that confirmation validated everything he had just done. "Exactly," he said, and that evidence was not reviewed before this trial continued. Judge Brooks did not respond immediately. He leaned back a fraction, his gaze steady, absorbing not just the words, but the timing, the delivery, the confidence behind them. Because something still did not fit. Evidence did not simply appear in the middle of the night and walk into a courtroom through the voice of an officer who was not even assigned to the case. There were procedures, layers, clear lines, and Donovan had just stepped over all of them as if they did not apply. Who submitted it? Brooks asked. The question landed clean, direct, leaving no room for deflection. For the first time, Donovan hesitated. It was small, almost invisible, but it was there. "It came through internal channels," he said, choosing his words more carefully now. "Not an answer." "Not really." Across the room, a low voice spoke up, measured and older, carrying the weight of experience. "That is not how it works." Heads turned. It was Thomas Reed, the courtroom bailiff, a man who had spent over 20 years watching cases unfold from the edges, a man who rarely spoke unless something needed to be said. He stepped forward just enough to be seen, his posture respectful but firm. "All evidence is logged, verified, and cleared before it ever reaches this floor," he continued. "Anything submitted overnight would still be pending review." Donovan's jaw tightened, the first visible crack in his composure. "This is an urgent matter," he replied quickly. "Protocols can be adjusted when necessary." But the room was no longer fully with him. Not the way it had been seconds ago. Doubt had entered, quiet but undeniable. Judge Brooks let that doubt settle. He did not rush to resolve it. He allowed it to exist, to grow, because doubt revealed truth faster than confrontation ever could. He looked down briefly at the file in front of him, then back up at Donovan, his expression unchanged, but his focus sharper now, more precise. "You interrupted an active trial," Brooks said slowly. "You challenged the authority of this court in front of a jury. And you are presenting evidence that has not been verified through proper channels." Each word landed with controlled weight, not anger, not emotion, just fact. Donovan held his ground, but the certainty in his stance was no longer as solid as it had been when he first walked in. "Because it matters," he said. "Because if this evidence is real, then everything happening in this courtroom right now is built on the wrong foundation." That line lingered, not because it was loud, but because it carried the implication that something bigger was at play. Judge Brooks studied him for a moment longer, not the badge, not the uniform, but the man behind it. And in that moment, something became clear. This was not just about evidence. This was about control, about timing, about forcing a narrative before the truth had a chance to speak for itself. Brooks placed one hand lightly on the bench, steady, grounded, then spoke with the same calm authority that had not wavered since the moment this began. "Then we will examine it," he said. Not rushed, not reactive, certain. And just like that, the direction of the room shifted again, not toward chaos, but toward something far more dangerous for the man standing in the middle of it. Process, structure, and truth that would not be controlled by whoever tried to deliver it first. The word examine did not calm the room. It tightened it, like a slow pull on something that had already begun to unravel. And for the first time since he entered, Officer Kyle Donovan did not immediately speak. He watched instead, measuring, recalculating, as if the path he had expected was no longer as clear as it had been just moments ago. Judge Nathaniel Brooks did not look away from him, but his attention shifted beyond him, expanding to the entire courtroom, to the jury who now sat straighter in their chairs, to the attorneys who were no longer certain of the ground beneath their arguments, to the quiet presence of Thomas Reed, who had already said more with one sentence than most would dare. "Clerk," Brooks said, his voice steady, "bring the submission onto the main screen." Allison Grant hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding, her fingers returning to the keyboard, pulling up the file that had appeared overnight, the file that was not supposed to be there, yet somehow was. The monitor flickered to life, casting a soft glow across the courtroom, and with it came a document header, official in appearance, formatted correctly, labeled as evidence. But something about it felt too clean, too convenient, like a story that had been written before the facts had a chance to exist. Donovan stepped slightly to the side, positioning himself where he could see both the screen and the judge, his posture regaining some of its earlier confidence now that the evidence was visible. "This is what I was referring to," he said, gesturing toward the display. "It changes the timeline. It changes the narrative. It changes everything." The defense attorney leaned forward, studying the screen, his expression tightening as he scanned the details. "Your Honor," he said slowly, "this document was never disclosed to the defense." The prosecutor quickly followed, "Nor to the state." That mattered. That mattered more than anything Donovan had said so far. Evidence that existed outside of both sides of a case did not strengthen the truth, it threatened it. Brooks let that reality settle before speaking again. "Allison," he said, "open the metadata." The request was simple, but it shifted the entire direction of the moment. Donovan's shoulders stiffened, just slightly, but enough for Brooks to notice. On the screen, the document expanded, lines of technical information appearing beneath the surface, timestamps, user access logs, system identifiers, the invisible trail that every digital file carried whether someone intended it or not. The courtroom leaned into the silence as Allison read quietly to herself, her eyes moving faster now, her focus narrowing. "It shows the file was created at 2:14 a.m., she said, confirming what had already been stated. Brooks nodded once. "And the origin?" Allison paused. This time, the hesitation was not subtle. It was visible. It stretched just long enough to pull every ounce of attention toward her. "It was entered through a secured terminal," she said carefully. Donovan exhaled, as if that answer supported him, but Brooks did not move on. "Which terminal?" he asked. That was the question, the one that separated surface from truth. Allison's fingers moved again, pulling deeper into the system logs, and as she did, the energy in the room shifted once more, not outward, not chaotic, but inward, focused, precise, like everything was narrowing toward a single point. Thomas Reed folded his arms quietly, watching not the screen, but Donovan. The defense attorney stopped taking notes. Even the jury seemed to sense that whatever came next would matter more than anything they had heard so far. Allison's voice came out softer this time, but clearer. "Terminal 7, she said. Brooks did not react immediately. He let the number sit in the air. Then he asked, "Location?" Allison swallowed once before answering. "Evidence processing room." That changed everything. Not because of what it meant on the surface, but because of what it implied beneath it. The evidence processing room was not open access. It was controlled, logged, monitored, and restricted to specific personnel. Brooks shifted his gaze back to Donovan, not with accusation, not yet, but with a level of attention that no longer treated this as an interruption, but as a development. "Officer Donovan," he said, calm as ever, "are you assigned to evidence processing?" Donovan's jaw tightened again, the pause longer this time, harder to hide. No, he said. One word. But it carried weight. Brooks nodded slightly, as if confirming something he had already begun to understand. Then explain to this court, he continued, how evidence entered through a restricted terminal in a secured room was delivered here by an officer who does not have access to that system. The question did not raise his voice. It did not need to. It landed heavier than anything shouted could have. Donovan did not answer immediately. For the first time since he walked in, the confidence that had driven him forward met something it could not push through. Not resistance, not emotion, but structure, process, and a man who understood both better than anyone else in the room. The silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was expectant, because now, this was no longer about whether the evidence mattered. It was about how it got there. And that question had already begun to turn the room in a direction Donovan had not planned for. The question did not echo. It settled, heavy and precise, pressing into every corner of the courtroom until even the smallest movement felt out of place. And Officer Kyle Donovan stood there with the weight of it on him, not as a challenge he could deflect, but as something that demanded a real answer. He shifted his stance slightly, a subtle adjustment that revealed more than any words could, because confidence did not need repositioning, but uncertainty did. I received the file through internal communication, he said finally, his tone controlled but no longer as sharp as before. It sounded rehearsed, but not complete. Judge Nathaniel Brooks did not interrupt him, did not correct him. He simply watched, giving him space to continue, because sometimes the most revealing thing a person could do was keep talking. Donovan hesitated again, then added, "It was flagged as urgent." I acted on that. That explanation floated for a moment, but it did not land. Not with the attorneys, not with the clerk, and certainly not with the man on the bench. Brooks leaned forward just slightly now, not in aggression, but in focus, like a lens tightening. "Who flagged it?" he asked. The follow-up came without delay, without emotion, but it carried more pressure than the first question. Donovan's eyes flicked briefly toward the screen, then back to Brooks. "I do not have that information," he replied. That was the second crack. Across the room, Thomas Reed exhaled quietly, the kind of breath that came from recognizing a pattern unfolding exactly the way it always did when something had been pushed too far. Allison Grant's fingers hovered over the keyboard, waiting, uncertain whether she should continue digging or stop where she was. The defense attorney leaned back now, no longer studying the evidence, but studying Donovan himself, while the prosecutor folded his arms, his earlier confidence replaced by something closer to caution. The jury watched in silence, but their attention had shifted completely. This was no longer about the case they had been selected for. This was something else, something happening in real time. Brooks let the moment stretch just long enough for everyone to feel it. Then he spoke again, his voice still calm, still measured, but now carrying a clarity that cut deeper than before. "You entered this courtroom with certainty," he said. "You interrupted a legal proceeding with authority. And yet, when asked the most basic questions about the origin of your claim, you have no verifiable source." Donovan straightened, trying to regain control of the narrative. "The source is the system," he said quickly. "The system does not make mistakes." That line was meant to restore confidence, but instead, it revealed something else. Brooks' eyes narrowed just slightly, not in anger, but in recognition. "The system records," he replied. "People make decisions." That distinction landed differently. It shifted responsibility. It pulled the focus away from something abstract and placed it back where it belonged. On action, on access, on accountability. Brooks turned his attention back to Allison. "Pull the access log for Terminal 7 between midnight and 3 a.m., he instructed. Allison nodded immediately, her hesitation gone now, replaced by purpose, her fingers moving with renewed urgency as she navigated deeper into the system, past the surface-level data and into the detailed records that could not be altered without leaving a trace. Donovan watched her, and for the first time, his attention was no longer on controlling the room, but on what might appear on that screen. The shift was subtle, but it was there. Thomas Reed noticed it. So did Brooks. Seconds passed again, but they felt longer now, heavier, as if the outcome of this moment had already begun to form before it was fully revealed. Allison's eyes moved quickly as lines of data filled the screen, timestamps aligning, user IDs appearing, access points confirming what had been entered and when. Then she stopped, not abruptly, but with a stillness that signaled something had been found. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady but lower now. "There was one access entry at 2:11 a.m. Brooks did not move. "Identify the user," he said. Allison's gaze remained fixed on the screen. She read silently for a second longer, as if confirming what she was seeing before speaking it out loud. The courtroom held its breath without realizing it. Then she spoke. "The login credentials belong to a temporary override clearance," she said. That was unexpected, not just for the room, but for Donovan. His posture shifted again, almost imperceptibly, but enough. Brooks absorbed that information without reaction. "Who issued the override?" he asked. Allison scrolled further, her brow tightening slightly. "The override was authorized manually," she said. Another pause. "No supervisor listed. That was not procedure. That was not normal. That was not acceptable." And everyone in the room knew it. Brooks turned his gaze back to Donovan, and this time, there was no ambiguity in it. Not accusation. Not yet. But direction. An unauthorized override. A restricted terminal. And evidence delivered through an unverified channel. He said, each element placed carefully, building something that no longer relied on assumption. "Do you understand what that suggests, officer?" Donovan did not answer immediately, because now, the room was no longer reacting to him. It was closing in on the truth that had followed him through the door. The question did not demand an answer. It exposed the absence of one, and that absence spread through the courtroom like a quiet realization that something had already gone too far to be explained away. Officer Kyle Donovan stood still, but the stillness no longer looked controlled. It looked calculated, like every second without a response was buying him time he did not actually have. Judge Nathaniel Brooks did not rush him. He allowed the silence to sit exactly where it was, because silence, when placed correctly, had a way of forcing truth to surface on its own. The jury watched without moving, 12 people who had come to weigh evidence in a case now witnessing something unfold that had not been scheduled, something that felt less like testimony and more like exposure. Donovan finally spoke, but his voice had shifted, not weaker, but more guarded. "It suggests a system error," he said, "or a manual override made under urgent conditions." The explanation sounded structured, but it lacked something essential: ownership. Brooks tilted his head slightly, considering the words not for what they said, but for what they avoided. "An override without authorization is not urgency," he replied calmly. "It is a decision." That distinction settled deeper than anything before it. Across the room, Thomas Reed's gaze did not leave Donovan, his expression steady, experienced enough to recognize when a situation was no longer about procedure but about intent. Allison Grant remained focused on the screen, but her breathing had slowed, as if she understood that whatever came next would define everything that had led to this moment. Brooks leaned back slightly, his posture unchanged, but his presence sharper now, more precise, like every word from this point forward would carry weight that could not be undone. "Let us be clear," he said. "A restricted terminal was accessed at 2:11 a.m. An unauthorized override was issued without supervisory approval. And within minutes, a document appeared that is now being presented as evidence in this courtroom." He paused, not for effect, but for clarity. "That is not a system error. That is a sequence." Donovan's jaw tightened again, the pressure no longer subtle. "With respect, Your Honor," he said, "you are drawing conclusions without full context." Brooks did not react to the challenge. He had heard variations of it before, in different rooms, under different circumstances, always framed as caution, always used as delay. Years ago, before the bench, before the robe, before the authority that now defined him, there had been another room, smaller, less formal, but just as revealing. He remembered standing there as a young attorney, presenting facts that were questioned not because they lacked merit, but because of who presented them. He remembered the tone, the subtle dismissal, the assumption that confidence required validation. That memory did not anger him now. It refined him. It taught him when to speak and when to let the truth build itself. And right now, the truth was building. Brooks looked directly at Donovan, his voice even, but unmistakably firm. "Then provide the context," he said, "because at this moment, the only thing this court has is a chain of actions that bypassed every established protocol." Donovan hesitated again, longer this time, and in that hesitation the room shifted further away from him. The defense attorney leaned forward slightly, no longer defensive, but observant. The prosecutor's posture had changed completely, his earlier certainty replaced by distance, as if he was already separating himself from whatever this had become. Allison's eyes flicked briefly toward Brooks, then back to the screen, waiting for instruction that had not yet been given. The jury remained silent, but their focus was no longer divided. It was fixed, on Donovan, on the answers that were not coming. Brooks did not raise his voice, did not escalate. He simply adjusted the direction. "Allison," he said, "is there any additional activity linked to that override?" The question redirected everything back to fact, back to record, back to what could not be shaped by interpretation. Allison nodded slightly and continued scanning, her fingers moving again, pulling more data, deeper logs, the kind that revealed not just access, but sequence, timing, connection. Seconds passed, but this time they felt different, heavier, as if the room understood that whatever appeared next would not just clarify, it would define. Then Allison stopped again. Her eyes narrowed just slightly as she read. "Yes, Your Honor," she said. "There is a secondary action tied to the same override." Brooks did not move. "Explain," he said. Allison took a breath, steadying her voice. After the file was created, it was accessed again at 2:16 a.m. from a different terminal. A murmur almost formed in the gallery, but it never fully surfaced. The tension held it back. Brooks' gaze remained fixed. "Which terminal?" he asked. Allison's fingers hovered for a moment before she answered. "Terminal 3, she said. Thomas Reed shifted his weight slightly at that, the smallest reaction, but noticeable, because Terminal 3 was not in evidence processing. It was closer, much closer. Brooks understood immediately, but he did not say it. Not yet. Instead, he asked the question that would bring it into the room without interpretation. "Location?" Allison looked up this time, meeting his eyes briefly before answering. "Adjacent corridor," she said. "Outside this courtroom." The words landed differently than anything before them. Not loud, not dramatic, but precise enough to change everything. Because now whatever had happened did not exist somewhere distant in a system. It had moved. It had traveled. It had come here. Brooks turned his attention back to Donovan, and this time, the space between them felt smaller, not physically, but in terms of what remained hidden. "You said you acted on urgency," Brooks said quietly. "But urgency does not explain proximity." Donovan did not respond, because now, the question was no longer about the system. It was about presence, and the room had already begun to understand exactly where that was leading. The word proximity did not just hang in the air, it tightened it, pulling every loose assumption into a single line of focus that now pointed directly at Officer Kyle Donovan. And for the first time since he had walked into that courtroom, the confidence that had carried him forward began to fracture under the weight of something far more precise than accusation. It was structure closing in. Donovan did not speak, not immediately, and that silence no longer worked in his favor. It worked against him, because now the room was not waiting for him to control the narrative. It was waiting for him to explain it. Judge Nathaniel Brooks remained still, but his attention sharpened further, his presence no longer just steady, but deliberate, as if every second was now part of a process that had already begun to move beyond interruption and into resolution. "Allison," Brooks said calmly, "pull the surveillance log for the corridor outside this courtroom between 2:10 and 2:20 a.m. The request shifted everything again, not outward, but deeper, into a layer that could not be explained away with words alone. Allison nodded, her fingers moving quickly, accessing a different system now, one tied not to documents but to movement, to presence, to who had been where and when. Donovan's posture changed again, subtle but undeniable, his shoulders tightening, his stance no longer grounded but braced, as if preparing for something he could not yet see but understood was coming. Thomas Reed stepped slightly closer to the side wall, not interfering, not speaking, but positioning himself where he could observe both the screen and Donovan at the same time, his experience telling him that moments like this did not need noise, they needed attention. The courtroom remained silent, but it was no longer passive, it was engaged, every person in it now part of something unfolding in real time. Allison paused briefly, then spoke. Camera 7 covers that corridor, she said. I am pulling the feed now. The screen flickered again, replacing metadata with grainy black and white footage, time stamped in the lower corner. Each second marked, each movement recorded without interpretation. Brooks did not lean forward. He did not need to. He watched with the same controlled focus that had not shifted since the beginning. Advance to 2:10 a.m., he instructed. Allison complied, the footage jumping forward, the corridor appearing empty at first, quiet, still, the kind of stillness that usually meant nothing. Then movement. A figure entered the frame from the far end, walking with purpose, not rushed, not hesitant, but direct. The courtroom did not react out loud, but the shift was immediate. Everyone saw it. Everyone recognized it. The uniform, the posture, the unmistakable presence of Officer Kyle Donovan moving through that corridor at exactly the time the override had been initiated. Donovan's jaw set tighter, but he did not speak. Not yet. Brooks let the footage play, not rushing it, allowing each second to unfold exactly as it had happened. The figure stopped briefly near a door, one marked for restricted access, then disappeared from the camera's view. Allison's voice was quieter now, but steady. That door leads to the evidence processing room, she said. No one needed confirmation, but it mattered that it was said. Brooks nodded once, then spoke again, his voice unchanged, but now carrying a finality that had not been present before. Continue, he said. The footage advanced. At 2:16 a.m., the same figure reappeared, exiting the same direction, walking back toward the corridor that led directly to the courtroom entrance. No urgency, no hesitation. Just movement. Intentional. Documented. Real. The room did not murmur this time. It did not need to. The evidence spoke clearly enough on its own. Brooks turned his gaze from the screen back to Donovan, and this time, there was no question in it, only recognition of what had already been established. You accessed a restricted area, Brooks said calmly. You used an unauthorized override. And you returned to this courtroom with a document you now claim was submitted through proper channels. Each statement aligned with what had just been shown, each one grounded in fact, not interpretation. Donovan finally spoke, but the edge in his voice had changed. It was no longer control. It was defense. That footage does not show what happened inside that room, he said quickly. It does not prove anything about the document itself. Brooks did not challenge the statement directly. He did not need to. It proves access, he replied. It proves timing. And it proves proximity. He paused, just long enough for the weight of those three things to settle. And that is more than you have provided to support your claim. Donovan's eyes flicked briefly toward the jury, then back to Brooks, as if searching for something that was no longer there. The room had shifted completely now, not in volume, not in movement, but in alignment. The uncertainty that had entered with Donovan was gone. In its place was something far more definitive. Process, evidence, and a sequence that could not be undone by explanation alone. Brooks placed both hands lightly on the bench, steady, grounded, then spoke with quiet authority. This court does not operate on interruption, he said. It operates on proof. The words did not echo. They settled. And in that moment, the balance of the entire room moved fully, unmistakably, away from the man who had tried to control it and toward the truth that had followed him in. The word proof did not end the moment. It sharpened it, like the edge of something finally exposed after being hidden beneath layers of assumption, and in that sharpened silence, Officer Kyle Donovan stood no longer as the one directing the room, but as the one contained within it. The shift was complete, quiet, but irreversible. Judge Nathaniel Brooks did not raise his voice, did not lean forward, did not change his tone, but everything about his presence now carried a different weight, one that no longer responded to disruption but defined the outcome of it. Donovan drew a breath, slow, measured, as if recalibrating one final time. You are making this look like intent, he said, his voice steadier than before, but lacking the authority it once carried. You are building a narrative around timing and location without proving what actually happened inside that room. The statement was careful, deliberate, designed to redirect, to reclaim space where there was none left. Brooks listened without interruption, his gaze fixed, not on the words, but on the man delivering them. Then let us remove interpretation entirely, Brooks replied, his voice calm, almost quiet, but precise enough to cut through any remaining doubt. He turned slightly toward Allison. Is there any record of file modification after the initial creation at 2:14 a.m.? Allison's fingers moved again, quickly now, as if she understood the direction fully. The screen shifted once more, revealing deeper logs, version histories, system flags that tracked not just access, but change. She scanned carefully, then spoke. Yes, Your Honor, she said. The file was modified at 2:15 a.m., 1 minute after creation. Donovan's eyes flicked to the screen, just for a second, but it was enough. Brooks did not miss it. Display the modification record, Brooks instructed. The data expanded, lines of code replaced by readable entries, user actions tied to timestamps, each one recorded without bias, without assumption, without error. Allison read it aloud, her voice steady but lower now, as if she understood the weight of what she was saying. The modification included altering the document header and inserting additional content into the body of the file. The courtroom did not react out loud, but the shift was undeniable. This was no longer about access. This was about change. Brooks let that distinction settle before speaking again. And the user associated with that modification? He asked. Allison paused for only a moment before answering. The same override credentials, she said. That answer did not surprise Brooks. It confirmed what had already begun to take shape. He turned his attention back to Donovan, and this time, the space between them carried no ambiguity at all. You did not just access the system, Brooks said calmly. You altered its output. Donovan straightened slightly, his expression tightening, the last fragments of control pulling into place. That is an assumption, he said quickly. Override credentials do not identify a specific individual. It was a technical defense. Precise, calculated, but incomplete. Brooks nodded once, acknowledging the point without conceding anything. Correct, he said. They do not identify an individual. He paused, then added, but they do identify sequence. That word landed differently. Sequence. Not who, not yet, but how. And how was already clear. Brooks gestured slightly toward the screen. An unauthorized override was issued at 2:11 a.m. A file was created at 2:14 a.m. That same file was modified at 2:15 a.m. And at 2:16 a.m., the individual who accessed that system returned to this courtroom. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Each piece aligned on its own. That is not coincidence, he continued. That is construction. The word hung there, heavier than anything before it. Construction, not discovery, not urgency. Something built. Donovan did not respond immediately, because now there was no space left to redirect. The room had already followed the sequence to its conclusion. The jury watched without blinking. The attorney said nothing. Thomas Reed's posture did not change, but his attention had sharpened further, as if he had seen this exact moment before, in different forms, under different circumstances, always ending the same way. Brooks leaned forward just slightly now, not to press, but to finalize. You entered this courtroom with a document you presented as evidence, he said. But what you actually brought into this room was a version of that document that did not exist before you created it. Donovan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, because the room no longer needed his explanation. The sequence had already spoken. Brooks held his gaze for a moment longer, then delivered the words that ended any remaining ambiguity. You did not interrupt this trial with evidence, he said quietly. You interrupted it with fabrication. The word did not echo. It settled. And in that moment, the entire courtroom understood that what had begun as a challenge to authority had become something else entirely, something that no longer questioned the process, but exposed the man who had tried to control it. The word fabrication did not create chaos. It created clarity, the kind that did not need volume to take over a room, the kind that settled into every corner and made it impossible for anyone present to pretend they did not understand what had just been revealed. Officer Kyle Donovan stood in that clarity, and for the first time since he had stepped through the doors, he was no longer positioned as an authority within the space. He was defined by it. His badge no longer carried weight in the way it had minutes ago, not because it had changed, but because the context around it had. Judge Nathaniel Brooks did not move immediately after speaking. He allowed the moment to breathe, to settle fully, because truth, once spoken clearly, did not need reinforcement, it needed recognition. and recognition was already happening. The jury sat completely still, their attention no longer divided between arguments and evidence, but fixed on the sequence they had just witnessed unfold in real time. The defense attorney lowered his pen slowly, no longer taking notes, no longer preparing for argument, because the focus of the room had shifted beyond the case itself. The prosecutor exhaled quietly, his posture easing back, not in relief, but in separation, as if he understood that whatever this had become, it no longer belonged to the case he had come to present. Thomas Reed stepped forward slightly, not in urgency, not in reaction, but in readiness, the kind that came from years of understanding exactly when a moment crossed from procedure into consequence. Donovan finally spoke, but his voice no longer carried the same edge, it carried resistance, the last attempt to hold on to something that had already moved past him. "You cannot prove that I created that document," he said, his tone controlled but thinner now. "You are interpreting system data without direct identification." The statement was not wrong in structure, but it was incomplete in weight, and everyone in the room could feel it. Brooks nodded once, acknowledging the point without conceding anything. "Direct identification is one form of proof," he said calmly, "but it is not the only one." He paused briefly, allowing the distinction to land. Courts operate on patterns, on sequence, on consistency of action. He gestured slightly toward the screen, where the logs and footage still remained visible. And what this court has before it is a complete sequence that aligns with a single point of access, a single window of time, and a single individual present at both locations. Donovan's eyes shifted again, just briefly, toward the screen, then back to Brooks, but the movement was no longer hidden, it was visible, and it was telling. Brooks continued, his voice still even, still measured, but now carrying a finality that did not invite interruption. "You accessed a restricted system without authorization. You altered a document within that system. And you presented that altered document as legitimate evidence in an active trial." Each statement was placed carefully, not rushed, not forced, but aligned, like pieces that had always belonged together. Donovan shook his head slightly, not in denial of the facts, but in rejection of the conclusion. "That is your interpretation," he said. Brooks did not respond immediately. He let the words exist for a moment, then answered with the same calm precision that had defined every step of this process. "No," he said quietly. "That is your sequence." The distinction closed the gap completely. There was no longer space for argument, because the argument itself had already been absorbed into the structure of what had been shown. Brooks shifted his gaze slightly toward Thomas Reed, a subtle acknowledgement, not a command, but enough. Thomas understood immediately. He stepped forward fully now, his presence no longer observational, but active, moving with the quiet authority of someone who did not need to announce what came next. Donovan noticed the movement, his posture tightening once more, but this time it was not preparation, it was realization. The room did not react loudly. There were no raised voices, no sudden movements. Just a collective understanding that the moment had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Brooks placed both hands firmly on the bench, steady, grounded, then spoke once more, his voice calm, but carrying the full weight of the authority he had held from the beginning. "This court cannot and will not proceed under compromised conditions," he said, "and it will not accept evidence that has been manipulated outside of lawful process." He paused, then added, "What happened here will be addressed appropriately." He did not specify how. He did not need to, because everyone in the room already understood what that meant. Donovan stood still, the last of his earlier confidence gone, replaced by something quieter, something heavier, the recognition that the position he had walked in with no longer protected him from the outcome he now faced. The jury remained silent, but their attention did not waver. The attorney said nothing, because there was nothing left to argue. Allison's hands rested lightly on the keyboard, no longer searching, no longer pulling data, because the data had already done its work. And at the center of it all, Judge Nathaniel Brooks remained exactly as he had been from the start, composed, controlled, and unmoved by anything except the truth that had revealed itself step by step, without force, without noise, without compromise. The collapse was not dramatic. It was precise, and it was complete. The room did not erupt after the collapse. It settled into something far more powerful than noise, a quiet recognition that what had just unfolded was not a disruption of justice, but a restoration of it. And at the center of that restoration stood Judge Nathaniel Brooks, unchanged in posture, unchanged in tone, but now understood in a way that no introduction could have accomplished. Officer Kyle Donovan no longer occupied the space the same way, his presence reduced not by force, but by the clarity of what had been revealed, and as Thomas Reed positioned himself beside him with calm professionalism, there was no struggle, no resistance, only the silent acknowledgement that the moment had moved beyond him. Brooks allowed that silence to remain for a few seconds longer, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for the weight of what had just been established, because moments like this were not about speed, they were about precision, and precision required space. The jury remained seated, but their posture had shifted, no longer observers of a case, but witnesses to a process that had proven itself in real time. The attorneys said nothing, their roles momentarily suspended by something larger than argument. Allison Grant looked at the screen one last time before gently lowering her hands. The data still visible, but no longer necessary, because its meaning had already taken hold. Brooks drew a slow breath, then spoke, his voice steady, controlled, carrying not just authority, but conclusion. This court will recess on the current matter pending review of today's developments, he said. All submitted materials related to this interruption will be secured and evaluated under full procedural audit. The words were formal, structured, but beneath them was something deeper, a clear boundary drawn between what had been attempted and what would be allowed. He paused briefly, then continued, his gaze steady across the room. Let this be understood, he said. The integrity of this court does not bend to urgency, and it does not yield to assumption. The statement did not rise in volume, but it carried through the room with unmistakable force. Donovan stood still, his earlier certainty replaced by something quieter, something internal, as if the realization had finally settled fully into place. He was no longer the interruption. He was the outcome. Thomas Reed gave a small nod, then guided Donovan toward the exit with measured calm, not as a display, not as a statement, but as a continuation of the process that had already begun. No one in the room moved to stop them. No one needed to. The direction had already been set. As the courtroom doors opened and then closed again, the sound did not echo, it concluded. Brooks remained seated for a moment longer, his gaze lowering briefly to the bench in front of him, then lifting again to the now silent room. Years ago, he had stood in places where his presence was questioned before his words were heard, where authority had been mistaken for appearance, where silence had been interpreted as absence. But he had learned something in those moments, something that had shaped every decision since. Power did not need to announce itself. It needed to hold. And today it had. He looked toward the jury one final time, his expression steady, composed, then spoke the words that would carry beyond this room, beyond this moment. What you witnessed today was not a disruption of justice, he said. It was a test of it. He paused, allowing the distinction to settle. And justice does not fail because it is challenged, he continued. It fails only when it stops responding with truth. The room remained still, but the meaning moved through it, quiet and complete. Brooks gave a single, measured nod. Court is adjourned. The gavel did not strike loudly. It did not need to, because everything that needed to be heard had already been said.